delighted to welcome to Green Signals a very special guest, someone we have been really keen to chat to from the very moment we started the podcast. He is uniquely qualified to talk to us given his tremendous experience at Treasury and Transport. Deep breath, he has been senior civil servant at HM Treasury 1987 to 2002 with a brief period from 1985 to 1997 working for Morgan Stanley in Hong Kong. Role at the Treasury included private secretary to the financial secretary and head of transport industries. He's been a board member at Ofcom, acting permanent secretary and director general at the Department for Business Innovation and Skills, permanent secretary of the DFT 2012 to 2017, which is when Philip was unfortunate enough to encounter me, but there you go. Permanent secretary at the Home Office 2017 to 2020, now retired from the civil service. His key roles included a member of council for University of Surrey, keeping his hand in, a non-executive director, Oxford Health NHS Foundation Trust, and chair of the National Churches Trust. Can't get my words out now. So welcome, Sir Philip Rutnam, who I suspect knows where more bodies are buried with the railway and its often fraught relationship with government and the Treasury than pretty much anyone else, which is really why we're delighted to have him along to point at the parts in the ground where we can find said bodies.
Well, thank you for having me, Nigel. Very nice to see you. And please call me Philip.
I will. Thank you. I will do that. But we're delighted you've been able to join us on Green Signals, where, look, it's not a TV interview. There's no tripwires. There's no ambushes. There's none of all that sort of thing. It's meant to be a sort of just an informed conversation, well, certainly from Richard on this subject. And we just want an objective chat about stuff we're all interested in and we can shed light on to boost understanding. And the long form of a podcast works so that it's not like a 2-minute Newsnight interview where you've got to get everything into 20 seconds. We can have a bit of a chat. Although with Richard, it sometimes ends up being quite a bit of a chat.
Well, welcome, Philip. And you see how this thing is going to go, obviously. So with that sort of slight pressure point there on me, let's dive straight into this. I share Nigel's excitement. This is going to be really interesting. We're going to cover how expenditure works, what fiscal rules are, capital and operating, business cases, HS2. There's loads to get through. So let's just dive straight in if we can. Everybody hears all the time of comprehensive spending reviews, and every so often the government decides how much it's going to spend for a period of time. Did you just kind of set out who runs those? How fixed are they? And what happens when everybody's bids exceeds the money that's going to be available?
So, okay, good to see you again, Richard. So, yeah, comprehensive spending reviews, usually they're run about every 3 years. They're run by the Treasury, and what they do is take a comprehensive forward look at all the different things government is spending money on, should spend money on, and tries to put plans in place for how much is going to be spent over those 3 years, on what, and how's it all going to work across both current spending and capital spending, across everything from health, education, defence, paying off our debt through to, of course, transport and railways. And every single time a spending review is run, the amount that departments, the health system, for example, etc., the amount they want to spend, of course, exceeds the amount the government is willing to spend. And the fundamental reason for that is the economy is only so big, the tax take is only so big, and no government, Labour, Conservative, or any colour, ever wants to put up taxes more than it has to. So there's always going to be more demand for public spending than there is supply. So fundamentally, what a spending review is a prioritisation exercise. You start with a certain view on how much in total government's willing to spend, and then through a mixture of political decision-making and administrative work by civil servants and others, you end up dividing that cake in so many different ways. One thing that's happened in the last 7 years, though, is we haven't really had comprehensive spending reviews because really ever since about 2016, 2017, the government spending plans have been more or less 1 or at most 2 years at a time. And one of the things that's likely to change after the election is there probably will be a comprehensive spending review setting out plans again for 3 or maybe more years.
Presumably COVID as well impacted on that, where it became quite short term in terms of sort of fiscal planning.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely right. Huge crisis.
Yeah.
Most plans put to one side just to focus on fixing the crisis. So there's been that, there's been political instability and so on. So we're really at an important point, I say, as we move into the next year to 18 months, and there will be almost certainly a big comprehensive spending review covering several years.
Now, you mentioned in that capital budgets and current spending, so operating expenditure, if you like. How much of a distinction does government, or does Treasury in particularly, draw on that in the end, or does it really just come down to cash?
Well, you said in the end. Let me come back to the in the end. But actually, in the beginning of the process, the middle of the process, and a long, long way through the process, current and capital are separated. They're thought about separately. So you put forward quite detailed plans for current spending, detailed plans for capital spending, and there's a different prioritization exercise usually that goes on under each. So obviously, capital spending is about things that last usually for a very long time. So you've got to have a different kind of quality of plans associated with them. You've got to have thought about deliverability. Current spending is usually stuff that's already happening. It's doctors and nurses or whoever who are already being employed. So no, it's a really, really important distinction through the planning process. But your phrase, in the end, my experience is what governments ultimately politically really care about is the total burden on taxpayers, whether it's current spending or it's capital spending, because that's what drives taxes and the level of borrowing. So you do come back at the very end of the process to the overall totals, and there's some trading off that goes on between current and capital. But the government planning process really does distinguish between the two up to that point.
Okay.
That's really helpful, because I suspect we will come back to that when we talk about HS2, cancellation thereof, Network North, and what the money is going to be spent on. But one other thing that's been massively in the press recently are these so-called fiscal rules, and they presumably have a major bearing on how public expenditure is thought about and committed to. And we've heard recently a lot of sort of to and fro between the political parties saying, oh, well, you're not going to be able to do that because you'll breach the fiscal rules. And Rachel Reeve saying, I'm not going to breach the fiscal rules. What are fiscal rules and why do they matter?
Okay, so fiscal rules, they're not laid down on tablets that come down from heaven. They're invented by politicians, and they're like self-imposed. And they only really emerged, first of all, in the 1990s, and then when Gordon Brown became Chancellor, he made a really big thing of fiscal rules. I don't know whether you remember, there was something called the Golden Rule, the Golden Fiscal Rule.
I do.
Don't ask me what it was. Basically, the idea, most countries actually do have some kind of fiscal rule, and the basic idea behind that is to set a constraint, as well as the constraint in terms of how much tax you're willing to raise, you think you're going to be able to raise now, this year. You should have a view to the sustainability of the public finances over a number of years into the future, because it's, it would be very easy to crater the public finances by promising to do loads of things in 3 or 4 or 5 years, which you're just not going to have the money for. So the idea is to make the public finances more sustainable by putting some envelopes there, which the level or the precise numbers may change as the economy changes, but it still imposes a constraint. And actually what it really does, the real effect of the fiscal rules, is to strengthen the position of the Chancellor in relation to all those ministers who just want more. They just want to spend more.
Sorry, Philip, go on.
No, I was just going to say, at the moment, actually, the fiscal rules, they're not, they've been described by the Institute of Fiscal Studies as the loosest we've ever had in 30 years. But basically what it says, you make a forecast into 5 years in the future, and who knows what the world's going to be like 5 years into the future. Anyway, this is what the rule says. You make a forecast 5 years into the future, and you have to assume, you have to be able to project that the government's debt as a share of our national income will be declining. Doesn't have to be declining by very much, but it has to be going down a bit, which means that you can't be borrowing too much at that point. Preferably you're not borrowing very much at all. And guess what? Each time we go through a fiscal event, something called the Office for Budget Responsibility makes a forecast. The Chancellor is able to show that, yes, the fiscal rules are being met just about, and then the world moves on. So they're not really that big a constraint, to be honest, at the moment, but it's still important for Jeremy Hunt, for any Chancellor, I think, to have them.
I think they're more than just about optics, then, more than about making them look more responsible.
It is more than optics, but optics is important because it conveys a message. The bit that's about more than optics is it depends on the forecasts made by this independent body, the Office of Budget Responsibility. They have independence, and they're able to project in particular how much government taxes are going to be in 4 or 5 years' time, what the state of the economy is going to be. We don't really know, but they can make decent projections, and that imposes a constraint of some kind on the total amount the Treasury can commit to spend. Overall, I'd say it's a good thing, but there's lots of argument about whether the detail of these fiscal rules is really robust and whether it's tight enough.
Because by your own admission, excuse me there, nobody knows what's going to happen in 5 years' time. So are we not into the realm of that famous military expression about no battle plan survives first contact with the enemy? So you're constantly going to be revising those forecasts.
Yeah, but there's another military phrase which is about having the battle plan. I don't know. You need the plan. Without the plan, you definitely without the plan, you're going to get defeated. But with the plan, you've got something to work with.
But just drilling down a little bit more into fiscal rules then, because, and this goes back to the capital and current spending argument, totally understand why you would want to really constrain the ability of a government, of a Treasury to, in effect, borrow for current spending, right? But capital is all about creating wealth in the future and over a sustained period of time. It does feel to me sometimes these fiscal rules, when it comes to capital, are such a self-imposed constraint that they're sort of slightly counterproductive. Operating, current spending, I totally get. Shouldn't we actually have different rules for different kinds of spending?
Well, there is a debate about that. And in fact, Labour, Rachel Reeves, the present fiscal rules don't really make a distinction between current and capital spending.
Sure.
Yeah, spending is spending. The Labour position, according to Rachel Reeves, is that they'd keep the fiscal rule I've just mentioned about share of debt, making sure that's going down in 5 years' time. It's very difficult to measure, as I said, but they'd also introduce another fiscal rule, which would be about the current spending, and that the current spending can't exceed our current income. Essentially, if you like, your P&L, as it were, the national P&L being in balance, which does implicitly potentially create a bit more headroom for capital spending, potentially. But wait to see what the numbers are. And that's linked a bit to a debate and some of the kind of left-leaning economic circles that maybe by focusing just on debt again, we're being too narrow. And what we should look at is national wealth, which is about, yes, it's about debt, but it's also about assets. So we should be looking at our willingness to invest in assets like new hospitals, new schools, new train lines, for example, and we should look at our wealth as, assets less debt. So there's a bit of a debate about that as well. But these things are quite abstract, and actually seeing them follow through into practical policies is another matter.
They are abstract, but I mean, you almost like rerunning the austerity arguments, sort of saying, well, actually, the kind of the George Osborne view of life a little bit was you can't spend what you don't earn. So if you can't afford it, chop it out. But actually, what we're really doing is saying, no, there might be a distinction between spending today, but actually spending to create wealth and income for the future.
Yeah, and there's another whole debate, obviously, that's been happening about what really happened under austerity. Did it go too far and all of that? And you don't hear that many people talking, except for maybe George Osborne, talking that proudly about austerity now.
I think that's a wonderful point just to move on, because I absolutely agree with that. Just one last thing, I suppose, on the most recent public finance statement was the budget in March of this year. We were all expecting some headroom to be created in terms of so that they would enable the Chancellor to make some tax cuts. He did in the end. He focused it on national insurance, which I think probably came as a bit of a surprise. There wasn't an income tax thing as well. But anyway, that apart, what he did do was he confirmed that he was going to protect the 1% real increase in public expenditure. Was that a good thing? I mean, presumably that helps the railway industry, because it means that in terms of the envelope that had been assumed, it was going to still be the envelope that everybody was planning with.
Okay, well, I'm glad you're feeling positive about that, because, I'd say for anybody running public services, it's better than a zero increase in public expenditure. But I think it's a really very real question about whether it is really sustainable. So what that is saying, there's two things it's saying. Well, first of all, you take a step back and you look at the pressures facing the country, and I'm not talking here about transport, just look at the demographic pressures facing the country in terms of pressures on the health service, the burden of pensions and so on. Those pressures alone, absent, unless there's a revolution in productivity and technology and the health system, unlike anything elsewhere in the world, those pressures alone are more than enough, I predict, to gobble up the 1% real increase in all public spending. Demographic pressures. Then the second thing I'd point to is the fact that actually the economy is actually forecast to grow by more than 1% real over the years ahead to 2028. And that's still not much growth, but it's forecast to grow like 1.5%. So what the 1% real assumption is saying is that actually our public spending, our spending on public services as a share of our national income is going to go down as a share of national income over the next 4 years. When you actually then look round at the state of public services, whether it's the criminal justice system I used to work in the Home Office, or whether it's health that I've mentioned, or whether it's any local government, or no doubt we'll talk about the state of the railways, but local roads, it doesn't feel like our public services are in such a great state that they can, we can afford to keep shrinking them as a share of national wealth. So my own prediction, I'll go this far, would be actually whoever wins the election, whatever party's in power after the election, that 1% real assumption is going to get revisited. It will end up being more than that, and that will have consequences for the level of taxes. But the reason we're not talking about that now, the politicians are not talking about that now, is they can't afford to talk about taxation, real significant changes in taxation before the election.
So I normally get accused on this podcast, Philip, of being victim elder. I think I might have some serious competition now. but sadly, I absolutely agree with you. And that makes perfect sense. Why would you talk about something as negative as taxation until the day after the election rather than the day before?
And as we've already got the highest level of taxation since the war anyway, it's really bad news, isn't it?
Yeah, we've got taxes in the UK are higher as a share of national income than since a bit after the war. You have to, this is personal view. You look at the you look at what's happening in society demographically, as I've mentioned, you look at social expectations about quality in public service, and okay, maybe we'll find very different models for delivering them, but otherwise, levels of taxes are actually much higher on the continent than in the UK still.
Let's lighten the mood. Let's talk about something really uplifting. Let's move on to HS2. Oh no, hang on, that wasn't anyway. Let's still go on to HS2. What an extraordinary period of time between the end of June last year and the beginning of October. The end of June, the Secretary of State for Transport is in Japan saying, This is marvellous, this is what we want. We're committed to going to Manchester. We're committed to going, doing the whole of phase 2. And actually, interestingly said, and despite the pressures of global inflation, which is actually what was driving an awful lot of the cost increase, we're still committed. He actually said, "'Cause I believe in Britain," which was quite a statement.
And the Prime Minister was saying similar things as recently as March.
Yeah, not quite as strong as that, but he was. But 3 months later, it gets canned. Right? Was that the triumph of the Treasury mindset? over the DFT mindset, I wonder, because this business case was signed off. I've always sensed that the Treasury culturally never really bought in. Was that now that Sunak is Prime Minister, he finally gets the moment to go, actually, I'm just not spending that money?
Okay, so actually, the first thing I'm going to say about HS2 is how personally disappointed I was by the decision. I mean, I worked on HS2 trying to turn it into a reality for 5 years, and dozens, hundreds of people, including in HS2 Limited and beyond, working on it. So, huge collective endeavour, and I thought a real achievement to get it to the point where actually the country was building it. So it was really disappointing. And I'm also actually disappointed because one of the things that this decision has done is kind of convey the message the UK can't do infrastructure. Whereas I also spend a lot of time on HS1, which everybody now takes for granted and thinks is fantastic. That was built on time, on budget, and just shows the UK can actually do infrastructure. Thameslink shows that as well. So just let me voice my disappointment. I wouldn't put. I think there's. You asked, is it down to the Treasury culturally not buying into it? I think there's probably an element of that, and I'll come back to that. But actually, I think my reading of it, my hunch is this was quite strongly a personal decision by the Prime Minister. Prime Minister of the country is entitled to make big decisions like that, big calls like that. I have a feeling that he was personally never convinced by the project, was very much in the skeptical camp, and he took those views from number 11 to number 10 when he became Prime Minister. I doubt he had a grand plan to cancel it, but I suspect a kind of accumulation of things led him to that judgment in the end. So I think it's a bit more, this particular decision, it's a bit more the Prime Minister's personal decision. I think he's making personal decisions like that. I mean, we're speaking today, there's been the recent smoking piece of legislation through House of Commons, and that's a bit of the same thing, I think. That's my personal hunch, no more than that. On the Treasury institutionally, shall I just pick that point up? I do think you're right. The Treasury, when I was at DFT trying to make very hard to make HS2 happen, George Osborne was the Chancellor for most of the time. He was a huge cheerleader for HS2. So that actually created a kind of axis between the department, large parts of the rail industry, and the Chancellor. It was the Treasury officials who were from the then Permanent Secretary down, who were really sceptical about it for a range of reasons. I think that scepticism, we never managed to change that. I think the institutional scepticism remained. And what happened was, with the change of Chancellor and then the multiple changes of Prime Minister, the kind of alignment between the Treasury institutional view and ultimately Sunak as Chancellor and then Prime Minister came out on top. It's a topsy-turvy world of decision-making, isn't it?
Well, but for one man to make that decision after, 13 years of genuine cross-party support and all the blood, sweat and tears and parliamentary approvals by the democratic process, that one man over a minibar in the Midland Hotel in Manchester decides to can the lot.
Well, yeah, you make a fair point, Nigel. I mean, prime ministers in our system, they do have a lot of power. We saw that with Boris Johnson. We see that for good or ill with successive prime ministers. So, I'm just trying to provide a kind of, what I think happened. I am disappointed, but he's got that authority.
Because that's interesting. I mean, there's been a number of questions saying, was it constitutionally defective? Was it parliamentary defective for, given the amount of scrutiny, the committees, the bills, all the rest of it, and then just in a heartbeat, it does feel as if it makes a slight mockery of the parliamentary process.
It's an interesting imbalance, isn't it? It's like, to make something happen, you have to put in layer after layer after layer of effort in thousands of man hours across every kind of branch of specialism, millions, actually, in the end, hundreds of millions spent preparing to get things to happen. And the level of kind of scrutiny and consent that you needed was enormous. And then to cancel it, apparently none, or just, as you say, one very concentrated decision. Now,
So
I guess that
do you
raises... Sorry, go ahead, Nigel.
I was just going to say, do you think that was genuinely the sort of Treasury mindset that Richard talked about, or was it, or maybe it was both? He thought he would get a big political boost from it.
To be honest, I don't think I doubt he thought he was going to get a big political boost from it. After all, if you're going to get a big political boost, you wouldn't exactly announce it in Manchester. But I think he thought it was really the right thing to do. That's my hunch. I mean, I haven't spoken to him. I think the point about this kind of imbalance between getting approval versus cancelling something, it raises to me maybe a bit of an institutional question. Maybe we need, if we're developing our regime for doing infrastructure projects, maybe we should have a bit more of a balanced approach. If we can make it a bit easier, possibly, to make things happen, maybe we could make it a little bit harder or a little bit more considered, the process for stopping something.
I mean, that's really interesting. On this podcast, we had the director of the Rail Freight Group, Maggie Simpson, who was talking about the hundreds of millions that have been invested by logistics businesses up and down the line of route,
particularly in the West Midlands,
particularly in the West Midlands, on the West Coast Main Line as well, which would have benefited from more freight because of the capacity release. And she said, if you're one of those investors, I mean, it's got an act of parliament. I mean, if you can't rely on that, what on earth can you rely on? And I suppose her point was maybe UK PLC's taken a bit of a credibility hit on the international investor front. So I thought it was quite an interesting angle, that.
You do need, as government, you need to be able to respond to changing circumstances. But the question is how. Do you need what's kind of process around that? What's a suitable, disciplined process around it?
But it was a good question, wasn't it? If you can't trust an act of parliament, what can you trust?
Well, it was quite passionately put. That's for certain.
Absolutely was.
What the DfT would say, I'm sure, is, well, the Act of Parliament, I imagine, is that the Act of Parliament was permissive. It gave permissions to do things. It didn't say you had to build the railway. It kind of gave you the option, but it did sort of rather create the expectation after so much effort you actually would.
I think that was the point.
That's a key point, I think.
Just on the question of funding, in a way, it's a little bit of a moot point, but not completely, because obviously we're still building phase one, we hope. That there's a view amongst, I suppose, people more aligned to the railway sector rather than necessary government sector, that it was going to be, the money for HS2 was going to be borrowed against future benefit streams. So therefore, if you cancel it, you can't borrow that money anymore because it was actually predicated on those future benefit streams, which has always been, I've always had a bit of a query about that. And then the second one was that if you cancel it, because it was borrowed against specific streams, you can't reallocate the monies to other things. Are those two things just urban myths, or is there some truth to them?
I'd put them more in the category of urban myth, to be honest, Richard. So first of all, the way that it works is not that the project was financed from borrowing certain amounts of money. The project was to be financed just from the government's total pot of funds, which is, loads of tax revenue I mentioned earlier, and then some borrowing. All of that money, all the tax revenue and the borrowing, think of it as pouring into one super gigantic bank account, which, by the way, is held in the Bank of England. And out of that bank account, super gigantic bank account, comes, money for the NHS, money for HS2, money for local government, pouring out the bottom of that bank account. It pays all the bills for public services. So it's not like HS2 was being funded from one particular stream of borrowing right up there in the gilt markets. It's just not how it works. That does mean that actually the money in principle can be reallocated, but actually there's then a kind of, there's a set of questions, a whole load of questions about that, in particular about timeframes. Because the truth is, well, we talked at the beginning about how the government plans its finances, even though the government makes commitments for things like aircraft carriers or building railway lines, contractual commitments that stretch many years into the future, it actually plans its finances in detail only for a few years at a time. Yeah, typically 3 years, but more recently, much less time than that. So the reason why reallocation is tricky is you may have a contractual commitment in, say, 2030. You might cancel the contract, get out of the contractual commitment, and say you're reallocating that money. But actually, until you've planned your finances for 2030, any reallocation is a bit hypothetical, because the real granular control of public finances is only just a few years at a time for the next few years and then onwards. So it would only be if you kept track of commitments that are built up or cancelled many years into the future, keep really detailed track of them, would you be able to tell whether it had been reallocated or whether it just disappeared into the background noise.
Oh, well, we'll come on to Network North in a minute and background noise and things disappearing. But just to clear that up, that's really interesting. So not only was HS2 not committed to against a specific stream of benefits, once it had been committed, it would then just became of how you were going to finance it. And in terms of financing it, in year 3 or year 4, if in year 3 or 4 we'd actually been running a surplus on public expenditure, it would actually have just been financed out of that big gigantic pot that year would have had more money going into it than went out.
Yeah, it's like it's just part of the total pot of government finances. Government is financed from a total pot of taxes and borrowing, and it sits there alongside all other public spending programs as one of the things that pot is financing.
So that does take us beautifully onto Network North, which was announced on the same day. Prime Minister was very excited about it. I mean, it got a bit of a kind of kicking, really, because we had projects that weren't even in the north, and then there were some mistakes and all the rest of it. But putting that to one side, because that was all a bit kind of trivial stuff, really. What it did feel like was something that had been really cobbled together in a hurry.
Over the minibar again.
And the permanent secretary, Bernadette Kelly, was obviously the accounting officer for the DfT, very careful to make very clear that nothing was committed, notwithstanding what politicians said, until there'd been a business case and that had been signed off, and it was clear that there was affordability and you're going to be able to do those things. So is it really possible then, and it's back to your timing point really, that Network North, some of those things may happen, but it's going to get increasingly difficult to prove they've got anything to do with the cancellation of HS2?
Yeah, I think that's basically fair, to be honest. I mean, Network North is still a thing now. We're talking about it now. Are we going to be talking about it in 2 or 3 years' time, particularly if the government has changed? No, we'll be talking about some other plans, probably with a different name. So, some of the projects listed in Network North will probably survive into those other plans. I hope they do. There's some interesting things in there, but then, there's other things that will probably disappear because other priorities come along, or because it turns out the business case just wasn't good enough. So to be honest, I feel the Network North thing is kind of likely, it no doubt will appear in manifestos, but I think quite likely it's going to be a passing phase. The strategic issue, the really strategic issue is, okay, if we are not going to do HS2 as originally planned, what are we going to do about interurban connectivity north to south? What kind of challenges do we face there? Do we worry about that as much? And then the other strategic issues are, what are we going to do about local connectivity, particularly in and around our big northern cities, which are underserved, and between them? Those are the kinds of issues that I think we're going to be debating rightly in 2, 3, 4 years' time. And how do we finance them? How can we do things more for less money? All that kind of stuff, rather than this slightly artificial, we're getting rid of phase 2 of HS2 and we're putting this complete solution of Network North in place instead. I just don't think it's really going to work like that.
Yeah, and if you listen to, say, Henry Murison, the excellent chief executive of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, that's exactly the narrative that he's got. He didn't really talk about Network North. He talks about Northern Powerhouse Rail, but he actually talks about connectivity. He talks about interurban, activity and so on. So let's just unpack those just a little bit more. So with the cancellation of HS2, quite rightly, Andy Burnham and Andy Street are going, excuse me, actually, Birmingham to Manchester, hugely important in terms of connectivity, economic access, right? And we know that our current network, it may not be absolutely chock-a-block today because we've seen a drop-off in traffic post-COVID, but 5, 10, 15 years' time, certainly within a planning horizon that's rational for transport, it is going to be chock-a-block.
Solid.
We better come up with our own solution. I mean, what would, if you were now back as permanent secretary of the DfT, what would your approach that be? I mean, should they be doing that? Should that not be something run by the DfT? It feels that the whole thing's a bit of a mess.
Okay, there's several different questions in there.
There are. I apologise for that.
So
I got onto it.
I think one thing for my just because I've obviously you can imagine a lot of sympathy for my former colleagues and feel for them in various ways. I think it's really important to recognise that their top job, their overwhelming job, their kind of 99% of any mental energy job is serving the government of the day till its very last hour, if indeed there's a change of government. So their job, Bernadette's job, the job of any permanent job of any civil servant in the DfT is to work for Mark Harper, work for this cabinet, work for this prime minister, work for this government's agenda, and they absolutely mustn't show any sign of doing anything different because constitutionally it's really important that they carry that through. Yeah. And we need them all to do that because that's about maintaining the confidence not just of this government but any government. I think there will be a very small little bit of thinking going, very small, just, if there is some change in the future, how might that work? It's not something that they're going to be devoting, lots of time and energy to, but just in the kind of back of their mind, and what are some kind of the options that might exist. I doubt that's, as I say, I doubt that's something that, any papers get written about, but obviously you can, think about things in a little fraction of time as well, a bit of spare time. I mean, my own view is that actually I think it's great that we're seeing some leadership from the combined authority mayors. They're seizing this issue, trying to get some traction, come up with some ideas. I think you're right that it can't be them alone who can think about these issues. We're talking here about key national arteries. Yes, of course, they're hugely important to the people of the West Mids and the people of Greater Manchester. Actually, they're important to just about everybody in the country. When you look at our economic and social geography, the key artery, the most important economic artery for the country in transport terms since the late 18th century has been London to the Midlands, the West Midlands up into the Northwest. And that's not likely to change. So we've all got a stake in it. So DfT will have to be centrally involved. I would hope that through the creativity and energy coming from Greater Manchester and West Midlands, together with kind of national involvement from DfT, actually we can probably come up with some inventive solutions, maybe better solutions than the one we had. We're certainly, I think, going to need to look at it, I'm going to use a bureaucratic phrase here, incrementally. So what are the things we can do? Break it up into chunks, maybe geographic chunks, but also think about it in terms of different components of a new improved connectivity in that corridor. Obviously in HS2 we had phase 2A, phase 2B, etc., etc. Maybe that's the right incremental breaks, incremental steps. So, in short, national effort, local and regional involvement very, very strongly, and thinking about it creatively and incrementally.
And I think the incremental point's extremely fair one. I mean, not least of which, phase 2A has got an act of parliament, phase 2B does not. And phase 2B has the opportunity to be, well, actually the Secretary of State has already said, I'm going to change what we're going to put through the House on 2B to focus more on Northern Powerhouse Rail and not the HS2 element. So they are different, and you're absolutely right. But can we just talk briefly about the role of private finance then on this? And I mean, we could probably have an entire podcast, well, probably 2 or 3, couldn't we, on private finance? But one of the things that the combined authority mayors are talking about is trying to get the role of private finance involved. Great. Now, there's some will say, and I would be one of them, which is in the end, in the final analysis, there's really only 2 chunks of money for the railway. Either comes from the passenger, I mean, freight operators as well, but it comes from users or it comes from subsidy. Really, private finance is effectively a loan which they're going to want repaid at potentially a higher weighted average cost of capital. So there needs to be a benefit for having used it. How do you think of private finance in the context of rail, particularly on things like infrastructure investments? Is there a role for it?
Possibly. I mean, the history of private finance in the UK. I'm actually more positive than quite a lot of people. A lot of people just kind of want to write it out of the picture altogether in relation to infrastructure, social infrastructure, economic infrastructure, and so on. I think actually it had a mixed record, that 20 years or so that we were using it. But mixed doesn't mean all bad. It means some bad and actually some okay and some good. And it seems to me the really interesting and important question is whether we can learn, if we want to do more in this area, can we learn from the stuff we got wrong to do it much better next time? And if you look at other countries in Australia, New Zealand, some US states, bits of Canada, they've actually continued to develop the private finance model, even in, it's a bit more contentious in Scotland maybe, but I do think there's some value in it. So I'm not one of the people who would want to write private finance out of the picture altogether. I have to say, if I was trying to re-inject energy into private finance in the UK, I'm not sure I'd start with HS2 Phase 2, which strikes me as likely to be at the kind of upper end of scale, of complexity and difficulty. I think there'll be bits that are relevant, obviously, stations maybe, and obviously there's development around stations, but I'm skeptical about thinking we can deal with this as a solution for the whole thing.
No, that's fair. Can we talk about business cases? Because this is one area where listeners to this podcast, but actually people just genuinely interested in railways get really quite animated, right? You often hear the phrase, okay, here you go, it goes something like this: that railway should be reopened between point A and point B because it's strategic, right? It's just a good thing to do. And then miserable people like me go, well, hang on a minute. What about the costs? What about the benefits? What about the risks? And they get, you're just boring us all to death with economics and finance. You should just get it done because you build it and they will come, right? And there's some truth in that, by the way. But
which is what's happened when we've done it.
It doesn't necessarily mean it was the right thing to do from a business case point of view. As you can see, with this, we have a friendly debate here as well. But having said all that, I do think there's an argument for business cases to start looking beyond traditional pure consumer surplus theory and start looking at wider economic benefits. Yeah. But there's danger of economic benefits because you run the risk of double counting benefits. Where's your... Where do you kind of sit on this? When someone says, Philip, what do you think of transport business case analysis? What's the answer?
No one's asked me that for a while, actually. Well, look,
welcome to our world.
Yeah. So I used to spend a lot of time with transport business cases. I think there's actually bits of truth in all the things you've said. So actually, I'm a believer in the business case approach. I think it brings some rigor. It makes you think about what level of confidence you can have in all elements of the project, including different types of benefit. It does include, really importantly, wider economic impacts are part of the business case approach. And if you look at HS2, actually, then you look at the way in which we developed the business case of that over the last 10 years or so. 5 to 10 years, it really put much more weight on wider economic effects. What could be the impact of this on economic growth and dynamism in different parts of the country? There's even more scope, actually. There's this famous thing called the Green Book, which is like a Bible of thinking about projects in government. And the Green Book actually was revised very importantly just 2 or 3 years ago to make it much more possible to put a lot of weight on social impacts of projects, sort of welfare associated effects in terms of all sorts of impacts on the way in which people live their lives, not just journey time improvements. I don't think the potential benefits of the wider scope of the Green Book have yet really worked their way through transport or a whole range of other areas in government policy and government planning. More has been done on that in Wales and Scotland, by the way. But first of all, I'm a believer in thinking about business cases long and hard, and that needs a methodical approach, and that's basically what the government economists are trying to say you need to do. But being strategic about it is also part of it, Richard. So there is something called, in every business case, there is something called the strategic case. The strategic case needs to cover things like, what's the impact of this project going to be on resilience? Resilience to adverse events, for example, is more and more relevant given obviously climate change and geopolitical change and all sorts of things. What's the impact of this relative to our highest level goals for government policy? So, for example, if you want to strengthen the union, it's not something you're going to be able to quantify in a business case, but it is very relevant actually to north-south connectivity. It's relevant to HS2 Phase 1, which will be improving journey times up to the west coast of Scotland. So being strategic is an intrinsic part of these projects. And it's important that you think about it methodically. You just don't latch on to anything you want to claim is strategic, and you think about it in a considered way.
Let me push back on that a bit, right? Because if you look at the full business case for HS2, it contains the 5 component parts. It's got a strategic business case, it's got an economic case, it's got it's got all the various elements that you would expect out of a government business case. The strategic business case is beautifully crafted. It talks about all the things you've described. It talks about capacity. It talks about resilience. It talks about all the sort of stuff that you would expect to see. The economic case primarily talks about benefit cost ratios, and quite openly says, when it comes to wider economic benefits, we've captured all the static ones, but we've not captured, for instance, all the dynamic ones, such as labour market restructuring or quite a lot of the inward investment generation. We know they're there, we know they're real, but they're very, very difficult, so we won't include them. Guess what? When it came to a fight over whether to can HS2 or not, everybody focused on the economic case. Andrew Gilligan focused on the economic case and the drop in the benefit cost ratio, completely ignoring all those other, level 3 dynamic benefits. Nobody talked about the strategic case when it came to binning it. So I take your point, but the strategic case and the economic case surely have got to get a lot more lockstep if they're going to be taken as credible things.
No, I agree. But what that's telling me is it's about the power of a number. In a political debate, a number, which is the benefit cost ratio, gets cut through. It gets attention. People kind of focus on it because it's concise. Whereas the list of strategic benefits, it's too long, it's too complex. People, it doesn't get cut through. So what I think that's not saying the methodology is wrong as such. What it's saying is you've got to think about the political presentation and how you're going to carry into the political presentation the real essence of the business case, which actually is not in the number. The number's part of it, but the real essence is wider than that. This is the right thing to do for the country because, and maybe it's that, you've got loads of very, very competent, capable economists working on something like a business case. You've got politicians who've then got to go and make the argument. Maybe what we need to do is to be a bit smarter about the translation process. Maybe we actually, maybe we should against the economists, be putting a little bit less weight on the benefit cost ratio, turning it into ranges, turning it into something that's a bit less precise, a bit less fixed. And that might help us to avoid having to be pinned on it in that way.
It's an interesting point. We had, Nigel and I had Bill Reeve on the programme a few months ago. Now, Bill is the director for rail at Transport Scotland. And he made a really good point, actually. We were talking about the Borders Railway down to Midlothian. And when Bill had been at the SRA, he was at the SRA the same time I was there, we decided not to do it because we'd done it against a Webtag, classic benefit cost framework. It goes to Scotland, and the Scottish government's approach is more about meeting their, I think it was 4 or 5 sort of almost like corporate objectives, and some of them are climate and connecting communities and reducing poverty and all that kind of stuff and improving accessibility. And hey presto, when you do that, it gets the project through. And I was a bit naughty. I said, well, you found a set of rules that justified what you wanted to do. And he quite rightly pointed back and said, no. We just changed the criteria. And I thought, yeah, that's a fair point. Maybe it's our criteria that need to be looked at, exactly as you're kind of alluding to there.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to this kind of, we can easily, I think as civil servants in particular, you can easily get caught up in the technical without thinking enough about how really is this going to support the argument that is there to be made.
My takeaway from that is Philip definitely supported the strategic argument, Richard, which will surface next time you and I talk about this.
Well, you've heard the word you wanted to hear, Nigel, to be fair. So, yeah.
In the way I wanted to hear it. I often hear it from you, but not in the way I want to hear it.
Let's look to the future.
Absolutely.
We can't say for certainty there will be a change of government, but there may well be a change of government. Let's just play fantasy politics for a minute. So Labour do win, and Rachel Reeve is now the Chancellor of the Exchequer. I mean, what is she facing? We talked a little bit earlier about, the fiscal rules and the challenges around public expenditure and it needing to go up more than 1% to be, and that's all fair enough. But when she looks at the next 3 to 5 to 10 years, I mean, what's the outlook? Does she have any real manoeuvring room to do any of the things that we would like to do in our sector, but I'm sure everybody else wants to do in theirs as well?
So I'll make 2 predictions. The first is that if Labour win and if Rachel Reeves is Chancellor, when she gets in, she'll find that everything is worse than they already thought. And the fiscal position is worse, and the pressures are greater, pressures on public services, etc., etc. So it's going to feel very, very tight and uncomfortable, and that will be, the message. The second prediction is that actually over time, provided we don't have some giant geopolitical crisis, which is a real risk, or there's some other external event that is a huge problem, provided that doesn't happen, then over time they will find some money. Because when you're actually in, it doesn't feel like that now, and they won't say it now and so on, but when you're actually in government, the systems are so large, so complicated, so there is always room to find something, I think, almost always, except in crisis. So I would predict they will find some money, and that's, public spending will go up by a bit more than 1% real a year, but the pressure on those resources will be intense, because the kind of, anxiety this sector's feeling is like, I also work in the health sector. The anxiety there is enormous, and the pressures are enormous, and of course it's got enormous political cut through. So the pressure will be intense. So I think that if I'll offer a kind of best case scenario for rail, if rail were able to demonstrate, if it gets fare revenues growing again strongly, if it's able to demonstrate cost control in a way that convinces the Treasury and DfT, if the kind of structural changes which are in mind come through and start yielding benefits, then I think you'd be in a better position to have a conversation about investment. And what I mentioned earlier, this is best case scenario. It may be nothing like this, but best case scenario, if a new Labour government wants to send a clear signal about investing in our infrastructure, then rail, provided it's got a strong delivery story and a social and economic story, rail will be in a reasonable place to make a case.
Oh, well, that's good.
That's best case scenario, Nigel. There's lots of.
I know, but it's a good place to start from. I was aware it was surrounded with caveats and ifs, but from somebody in your position to take that view, I think is pretty encouraging, because all it asks is the railway gets its bloody act together and delivers in the way it needs to deliver to warrant such support.
That is absolutely critical, and also being able to communicate that it's got its act together. Demonstrating it in the numbers. We talked earlier about numbers. Nothing carries as much, credibility as numbers. And coming up with sensible, not over-ambitious plans that work with real social and economic priorities. But look,
a boring, reliable railway, you might say, Richard.
Yeah, I think this is a time. I mean, if we don't have a huge geopolitical crisis, if we don't, then I think this decade ahead of us is a time for good, boring, reliable government and good, boring, reliable delivery. And I think there's a lot of mileage in that kind of theme worked through in detail in all sorts of ways.
I think that's incredibly powerful. I mean, that very much chimes with what we've been chatting about with lots of people the last couple of months, really. I suppose the final question on that, though, is, Great British Railways, rail reform bill, a model which does seem, the good news is, and this is not a go at the Department of Transport, it just puts the responsibility in the place most likely to be able to affect change in delivery. So it puts the delivery responsibility really back where it should be, which is, in the industry. But also at the same time, GBR is almost predicated on a lot of private sector involvement, commercial contracts, sort of concessions, but still a guiding mind, corralling everybody rather than necessarily a more directing mind. What final thought final question for me, really. What's your, you've looked at GBR, you've looked at the rail reform bill. What's your kind of reaction to that? Good, not so good, or just simply anything to start helping it get down the road?
No, I think basically it's very sensible, to be honest. I think there's lots of questions, but the basic idea that you need, you call it guiding mind, call it leadership, call it more integration, whatever you like, bringing more of the rail industry together in this integrated rail body, aka GBR or whatever, so that it can plan across the different elements of the industry much better and then deliver, execute with more confidence and assurance. It will inevitably be there'll be more command and control, I think. But we're in a phase where what we need, I think, above all, is delivery and to rebuild confidence in the industry. So on the whole, I'm positive about it. If you wanted I've got one general comment and then one thing I'd suggest the industry needs to watch. So the general comment is I really like the kind of some of the private sector innovations we've had. I rather like travelling on the open access operators, for example. I think the freight industry's done a pretty good job. I hope we can keep space for that kind of stuff. That is actually, I think, down to the mindset above all in GBR. Never mind the kind of politics, but if they have enough of that mindset and find a way of living with that kind of slightly, edgy creativity, that would be great. That's my ask, because I'm not a railwayman, so no, there's loads of reasons against that, but that's one ask. The thing to watch, which I haven't seen made much of, is about financial planning. So there's nothing about it in the bill, but if Labour does get in, and if they do something that's like this, but with more of a kind of a bit of a nationalisation flavour to be worked out, if they do all of that, then you need to watch one big benefit the industry has got, it may not feel like it, but it really is a benefit compared to the old days, is this planning period thing where you have 5-year control periods. You've got a regulator that provides some shelter to the industry, so you're not completely at the mercy of the Treasury. You're able, in the rail industry, is able to plan investment in blocks of time. British Rail in the old days was not. It used to have to go cap in hand to the Treasury every year to balance its books. And so there's something in there, I think, about if this debate if we get Labour government and the debate moves forward, you need to make sure that you get sufficient protection, I think, from the Treasury through some regime like that, control periods or whatever.
I've got two last questions, Philip. One very serious and one utterly frivolous. The serious one is you just use the expression command and control, and you thought we're going to need to see more of it. There's an argument we've already got too much of it, and it comes from the DFT. Were you still permanent secretary? How comfortable would you be the extent to which the DFT is absolutely controlling everything? You hear people say MDs can't blow their noses without the permission from GMH, and surely none of this can happen unless the DFT either steps back or is made to step back, and people don't easily cede power, do they?
Well, I think that's basically a large part of the idea behind GBR, isn't it? And the rail reform bill. You take stuff away from DFT. So if there's command and control, if there's more control, it's held within something that is actually properly part of the industry. Love DFT though, I do. I think it would be better to have it in, GBR,
So do we.
rather than in Great Minster House. Even though I put a load of effort into trying to get some really good people to work in DFT to do that kind of stuff, better to have it in the industry. The thing to watch is that ministers will still care about the 0718 from Castle Carey or whatever it is.
Of course they will.
And when it gets cancelled 2 weeks in a row, they will be calling the chief exec of GBR in to Great Minster House to explain to him or herself. So finding a way of creating sufficient space, protection, cover for GBR really to do its job well is critical. That's partly what I mean about the money thing, but it applies on operations too. That's the new dynamic that needs to be created, and that's going to be hard.
Okay. And now my frivolous question, which you will either think is silly, naive, or roll your eyes at. I've been lucky to a degree to have contact with people like you and Bernadette and other permanent secretaries, but most people have no concept of what a senior civil servant looks like beyond Yes Minister, about these shadowy figures. And I've got to ask you this. One of my favourite bits of Yes Minister, I think, comes from the very first episode where Hacker's talking about answering the public's questions. And so Humphrey says, can't do that. He says, the minute we answer the public's questions, we're all in real trouble. And he pauses for a minute. He says, well, I'm glad you answered my questions. To which somebody says, I'm glad you thought so, Minister. How often did you find yourself in the I'm glad you thought so, Minister frame of mind? Or is that a complete confection? Mrs. Thatcher famously regarded it as a documentary rather than a comedy. Is it complete fiction, that? I'm glad you thought so.
So I think like any comedy, for the comedy to work, it's got to have a grain of truth, right? What everybody focuses on is the grain of truth. But the real truth, the rest of reality, is it's not like that at all. You're trying to get things done. You're trying to make HS2 built. You're trying to get, find somebody to come in and sort out rail franchising. You're trying to work out how you deal with the next select committee and all that kind of stuff. So the real truth is my former colleagues, actually, I am completely confident, they work really hard paddling away to try to keep the ship or train of state on the road. To mix all my transport metaphors in one sentence.
Well, thank you for that. That's good to know. And look, thanks for doing the show today. It's been a revelation to me, more than I suspect to Richard, in that just a voice from such a senior level explaining such important stuff and how it works. And I think it's been great. And who knows, we may want you back for some other explanation at some point, Philip. But seriously, from my point of view, thanks ever so much for making the time and doing it all with such good humour. Even my frivolous last question.
Likewise, it's been absolutely superb. I can't believe. Can you believe it's 30 years, over 30 years since you and I worked together on the Northern Line PFI. I think you were a grade 7 in the Treasury. I was just come out the graduate scheme at London Underground. Hasn't an awful lot happened since, but it's been absolutely terrific. Thank you so much.
It's been a real pleasure, and I still remember the celebratory drinks to mark concluding that deal, Richard. So sticks in the mind.
Must have been some party.
By civil service standards, it was.
I'm glad you thought so,
it was brilliant. Well, look, thank you so much. And all the very best with whatever you're doing now. And we just really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Philip.